In today's video, we're going to talk about rebranding as a contested process. This is for the OCR A-level spec, and we just talked about rebranding and the strategies involved, and we're now going to look at how sometimes that doesn't always work, and there are people who win and lose in that scenario. So here's an example of a protest that's gone on in East London when they built the new Olympic Park. There's been some changes in that area, and people have been oppositional to the changes because it's changed the character of the local area. This is kind of proof that rebranding is not a completely seamless process. The changes made often don't suit everybody, and often local residents aren't consulted heavily, and therefore there can be conflict between the people doing the rebranding, like the local government and the market forces, and the people that actually have to experience it, so that can be local residents that have lived in that area. I'm going to talk about changing the character and how we can see places rapidly change and how they actually feel to live in. There's a term called gentrification, so it's the idea that wealthy people and businesses that they own move into poor working class areas in an effort to regenerate them and do them up. But in the process of doing that, they completely change the character of the neighbourhood. So they not only make physical changes, so they improve often the built environment, but those can often lead to demographic changes. So the type of people that live there, ethnic groups can be pushed out, and also kind of the age dynamics can change depending on the group moving in. So this is a really controversial process, and as you can see, people will protest gentrification, and if you just look Google on the internet for a bit, there's lots of controversy over this. It's controversial because sometimes, as we can see here, the pictures on the top are what the businesses used to be there and the businesses now after rebranding. So it's a kind of very fancy Italian restaurant. So the problem here is that when we put a lot of money in, this new money from wealthy residents come in, that often leads to changes in the types of the services. So the local shops that have been there for years, the corner shops and the newsagents, they suddenly get replaced by restaurants and fancy wine bars and services that wealthy residents want to have. This is a problem because obviously those local shops disappear, and especially if you're a local resident who is poor and you've been living there a long time, you often can't afford these services that come in. Like I said, they wouldn't be able to afford this expensive wine bar, and therefore they start to feel excluded from the community in which they have. The other thing is that they actually lose really important services. That vegetable market would have been an important service for local people, and now is completely gone. So not only do we see the services change, but when a lot of money is pumped into an area and regeneration starts to happen, we often see property prices go up, and that can be a positive, but also we see the rents go up, and that can be a bigger problem. This person is protesting, saying, why do they have to move out? And so obviously when we put the rents up, people who've been living there a long time, especially the poorer members of that community, might not actually be able to afford those rents. And because they can't afford the rents, they therefore have to move out of the area. And so they're essentially forced slowly out of their area because they can't pay the new prices that this new area has started to ask for. This is not only in terms of people moving out, but when I said it could change the demographics, we can see that gentrification can sometimes be called whitewashing. This is whitewashing because often the people that are moving in are wealthy white residents, and the people that they displace, who get forced out, are often communities of colour, so black and Asian. This happens a lot in America, but it also happens in the UK, and I'm going to use an example in a second. Because we see communities of colour being removed from areas, it can obviously lead to a change in not only the demographics but the culture. So cultures and communities suddenly get broken up as people who've been there, living there a long time, are suddenly dispersed because they can't pay the rents and they don't have the facilities that they need in that area. Here's an example in the UK. The picture on the right is of Brixton Market in the kind of 60s and 70s. This was a really famous kind of local market, and it was in an area where there was lots of Afro-Caribbean and Indian people living, and so the businesses reflected that. The businesses were for those people who lived in that local area. There's been a huge regeneration in this area, and it's definitely an example where Some people could accuse it of being of whitewashing, because now the services you can see on the left are completely different. Rents have gone up, and so all those greengrocers and clothing shops that were made for that local community have disappeared and instead been replaced with services for tourists. So the Brixton Market now is a champagne bar, a pizza restaurant, and various other places like that. It's an example where the council is trying to go towards a different image. They want to have it as a place for tourism and retail, and unfortunately that doesn't actually help lots of the established communities that have been there for a long, long time. In terms of favouring certain groups, we've kind of hinted at there, but the idea that some players benefit more than other groups through the rebranding process. What I'm showing you here is Liverpool 1, which was the large flagship retail centre they built near Toxteth, and that was really beneficial for people that wanted to set up new businesses, entrepreneurs, but also people who lived in the suburbs who would come in to use this retail park and because they could afford the services. However, this didn't help everybody. The regeneration that happened was very, very localised. We can see this blue and white area shows you where deprivation has lowered. And obviously, people living in Toxteth don't actually get any benefit from this retail park. This is largely because they don't have either the money to be able to use those services, they don't have the money to be able to invest in and make their own businesses there, but also they might not have the skills to be able to access any of the jobs available in a place like Liverpool 1. So even though this project might be good for Liverpool as a whole, it doesn't actually help those local people, and in fact helps entrepreneurs and people who live on the edges of the city rather than the people right next to it. Just to kind of hammer that point home, this shows you the change in the deprivation rank in the area. So this blue colour shows me that where I've built flagship projects and there's been wide regeneration, so Liverpool 1 is in this circled area, that it's become hugely less deprived. The national rank is improved by 20% for that area. But Toxteth is white in this graph, and that means there's been literally no change. So we can again see that some areas become less deprived because of this regeneration, but really, really close locations and the people living in it have seen very, very little change. In terms of, sometimes there's a difference in priorities between a rebranding project, and an example of this, staying with the Toxteth, is Liverpool Vision were the regeneration organisation that helped build that big project called Liverpool 1. Their priority was to rebrand Liverpool as this really positive place, get away from that kind of port, deindustrialised image, and make it a really key place of retail and culture. And they were therefore trying to attract big brands. So in this Liverpool 1, you've got John Lewis and Odeon and Disney, all huge transnational brands that they wanted to get in here. And so that was their priority. Unfortunately, this wasn't the priority of some of the local businesses. So what happened is that the local stores were either replaced or not consulted in the branding process, so they didn't really get a say in the fact that this huge project was being built. And in the picture here is a local famous store. It's a place called Quiggins. It's a really alternative clothing shop, and it had no input in the building of Liverpool 1. It was eventually basically forced out. It was sold, and even though they tried to build it in an alternative location, it just ended up closing. And that shows you that the priorities between Liverpool Vision and the local shop owners were completely different. The last thing in terms of priorities, when Liverpool Vision were building it, they actually used cheaper foreign labour, so they didn't use local labourers, and that was because they wanted to keep their costs low and didn't want to have massive expense. But obviously this was not the priority of local labourers who wanted to actually have work, and so there was obviously lots of frustration with the local workforce. Many of those people would have lived in Toxteth and not been able to have jobs even though it was right on their doorstep. So these show you that there's a change in culture. Often certain rebranding projects favour certain groups, and often there is a difference in priorities between what the kind of people making it want and the people that actually are affected by it actually want. So this is why rebranding can be quite contested.